Why was she the only one who saw the danger before it happened? That question had followed her across deployments, across states, across the silent corridors of bases where respect was often given before it was earned, and rarely to women like her. Gunfire tore through Mersey Valley before anyone could react. One heartbeat, there was radio chatter and confident footsteps in the pine. The next, the air was shredded by machine gun bursts and the sharp hiss of an ambush springing from shadow. The SEALs dove for cover, too fast, too wide, their perfect spacing dissolving into chaos. And then one shot. A single, cold crack from the ridgeline. It silenced everything. They told her to stay with the trucks. Guard girl, they'd called her. Keep the engines warm. Real operators will take contact. 3 minutes later, those same operators were shouting into their radios, begging for the name of the shooter who just saved their lives. But Mara Hale Quinn didn't move. She didn't need to. High above them, in a bed of pine and rock that smelled of oil and sap, Sable One had already been waiting. Her M2010, chambered in .300 Winchester Magnum, rested across a bipod, the barrel cold and calm, like her heartbeat. Through her loopled Mark V HD, the world had narrowed into thin slivers of movement, broken shadows, and the faintest traces of bootprints pressed into the dirt below. The others didn't see it, they couldn't. Mara had been in position long before the SEALs finished loading their gear that morning. She always moved ahead of time, because patience wasn't just her virtue, it was her weapon. At 29, she had the kind of steadiness that couldn't be taught in a classroom. It came from childhood winters in Montana where her father, an old hunting guide with hands scarred from rope and frost, had taught her to track elk through snow and silence. "The forest talks," he used to say. "You just have to stop talking back." That silence had shaped her, the stillness, the patience, the ability to watch an entire valley breathe and know where it would exhale violence. Below her now, the four-man reconnaissance element, Lieutenant Cole Ramsey's team, moved through the pine line with the swagger of men who thought danger respected rank. They carried themselves like the valley owed them safe passage. It didn't. They called her guard girl that morning. They laughed when she pointed at the topographic map and mentioned choke points she'd found during her recon, a draw where fallen timber made a perfect kill zone, and a narrow ledge ideal for an L-shaped ambush. Ramsey had nodded, dismissive, polite in tone but not in meaning. "We'll keep our buffers. You hold Overwatch." Overwatch, the word had sounded like a leash. She'd watched them go, helmets bobbing through the pines, joking, confident. Operators who had lived long enough to believe they were untouchable. She respected them, but she didn't trust their certainty. Because certainty got you killed. Mara adjusted her scope. Distance, 600 meters to the valley floor. Elevation gradient, 780. A sweet line, far enough to see, close enough to strike. She logged each movement below with the same quiet discipline her grandfather had once demanded during her teenage years on a shooting range in Whitefish. He'd been a Korean War marksman. The old man never raised his voice, but when she missed a shot, his silence said more than anger could. "Read the wind," he'd tell her. "The wind's the truth. It doesn't lie for pride." The valley whispered the same lesson now. The Mersey air was thin, cold, dry, high enough that a single misjudgment could turn a clean hit into a wasted round. Mara compensated. Wind, 5 meters per second, cross from west to east. Half a mil left at 600 meters. Barometric density adjusted. Every number was a promise. Every variable a decision she would own. Below, the SEALs spread into their pattern. It was textbook spacing for open desert, good visibility, bad concealment. In pine, it made them perfect targets, compressed intervals, shared cover. One machine gun burst could eat them whole. She keyed her radio twice, calm, measured. Sable 1 to Crow 2 suggests tighter spacing. You've got 2 likely ambush sites along axis Bravo. Range card available. Static. Then laughter. Copy that, Sable One. Keep that truck warm. Pride has a way of eating foresight. Mara let the silence return, her finger resting along the guard of her rifle. She didn't argue. She just watched. Minutes passed. The forest shifted. Branches swayed in a wind too soft to move them that way. A reflection flashed, just for a heartbeat, off a piece of metal near a rock line that hadn't been there the night before. That was it. Her breath slowed. Not yet. Not until she was sure. She cataloged the variables, movement count, distance between glints, possible interlocking fields of fire. There were too many angles for a hunting camp, too much silence for goats. She murmured to herself, barely audible. It's a setup. Her father's voice echoed beneath the thought. Pride deafens men. Assumptions bury them. Down below, Lieutenant Ramsay's laugh broke the stillness. Too loud for the valley, too human for what was about to happen. Then the world exploded. A burst of PKM fire hammered the clearing. Branches shredded. Bark split. The seals hit the ground, scrambling for cover that barely existed. Smoke and dust bloomed through the valley like a cruel revelation. Contact north on my 6, Ramsay's voice cracked through the net. Mara was already tracking. Her reticle danced from muzzle flash to flash, plotting geometry and intent. Automatic weapon, stationary mount. At least 8 hostiles, maybe 10. Coordinated, disciplined, fast. A commander's rhythm. Her pulse didn't rise, instead it slowed. She inhaled through her nose, exhaled through her teeth. The valley narrowed, time bent. She saw the man with the RPG tube rise behind the ridge. She knew he had 10 seconds before that rocket flew, and 10 seconds was more than enough for her. Her thumb touched the bolt. Her cheek pressed to the weld. Her father's words whispered in memory. And then, a single crack. The man never fired. Through her scope, she watched him fold backward as the .300 Magnum round found his shoulder and carried him down into stone. A second shot followed, the spotter this time, caught mid-turn, a flash of confusion frozen forever. The radio below erupted. Where the hell are those shots coming from? They didn't know, they didn't need to. She told them already. She was covering the seals. Through the scope, the valley became a language only she could read. Every flash, every stumble, every second of hesitation was a syllable. She translated it all in silence. Mara pivoted her rifle, scanning. PKM at 870 meters. Spotter moving between positions. Coordination too tight. She identified the leader, the one carrying the Motorola, shouting into it like he owned the air. He was moving between rocks, directing fire. Take the head, the body falls. She adjusted, 2 clicks for elevation, half a mil left for wind, breath steady. She squeezed. The round struck clean through his upper chest. He dropped mid-command, radio still open. The valley stuttered. Coordination faltered. Then chaos. The insurgents fired wildly now, angles broken, rhythm gone. The SEALs used the pause to drag one of their wounded behind a fallen log. Ramsay's voice came again, different this time. No pride, just desperation. Sable One, we need that launcher down, now. Her hand didn't tremble. Her scope tracked left 2 figures, 420 meters. RPG team setting up again. Her heartbeat matched the wind. She fired once. Then again. Both dropped before the rocket tube lifted. The valley's tempo changed again. The sound of death had rhythm, and she was its conductor. Every shot, every pause, was part of the symphony. Below, she could hear them moving, Rojo's grunt of pain as blood spread across his shoulder, Park yelling as he fed a belt into his saw, Morales dragging cover. The men who had mocked her were now trusting her completely, even if they didn't yet know her name. The rifle's recoil pressed against her shoulder like a heartbeat she could trust. 4 seconds between shots. Adjust. Breathe. Fire. Through her scope, she watched the ridge shift, fighters scattering, their ambush collapsing under its own noise. One tried to flank left. He didn't make it 3 steps. And still no one saw her. That was the point. When the Apache finally roared over the ridge, rotors tearing the dust into violent spirals, the SEALs were still alive because of her. Mara lowered her rifle, the scent of burnt powder mixing with pine. Below, they couldn't see her. They'd never really looked. But for the first time, their survival wasn't their own doing. And in that silence that followed the last burst of gunfire, she let herself breathe. The mission would be logged as successful extraction under fire. The debrief would speak of quick reactions and coordination, but she knew better. Because while they'd been pinned under arrogance and noise, she'd been patient, calculated, invisible. Sometimes the best cover isn't distance. It's disbelief. As the valley exhaled smoke and echoes, Mara stayed still, cheek pressed to her scope, the .300 Magnum cooling under her hand. No one would write her name on the first report. They never did. But somewhere in that fatting radio static, a single voice whispered the truth. Who's covering the SEALs? A pause. Sable 1. And with that, the mountains went quiet again. The valley still smelled of cordite and fear. Smoke lifted like ghosts from the pine, curling through sunlight that felt too calm for what had just happened. The Apache thundered past, their shadows slicing across the wounded ground, and for a long moment, all that remained was the sound of wind scraping through needles. She didn't move. Through her scope, the world was still breathing in slow, broken beats, movement in the brush, flashes of retreat, men crawling away from what they thought was safety. She could end them, all of them, if she wanted. But this wasn't a hunt. It was a promise kept. One more breath, one last check. No more muzzle flashes. No more cries. Mara exhaled, slow, deliberate, letting the rifle rest against the soil that had trembled with each recoil. Her fingers ached, not from the shots, but from restraint. She'd learned long ago that pulling the trigger was easy, deciding when not to was the hard part. She keyed her mic twice, quiet clicks, Roger ×2. The signal that Overwatch was still alive, still covering. Below, the SEALs began to move, dragging wounded, whispering names she could only half hear. Lieutenant Ramsey's voice came back on the net, hushed, ragged. Sable 1, that you? Copy, she said. Silence then. Stay up there, we're moving to exfil Route Bravo, keep eyes north. Professional tone, no jokes this time, no guard girl. Respect doesn't always arrive as apology. Sometimes it's in the way a man stops laughing. She watched them crawl, stumble, reform their line. They looked smaller now, not because of distance, but because the valley had humbled them. She remembered her father again, years ago, under a Montana dawn so clear it made you feel guilty for breathing wrong. He'd set tin cans at 400 yards, hands rough, voice soft. Don't shoot to prove, he'd said. Shoot to protect. Every shot means something. That morning she hadn't understood. Now she did. When the last SEAL disappeared through the tree line, she began to dismantle her position. Every movement was ritual, bolt open, chamber cleared, spent brass collected one by one and tucked into a canvas pouch. The forest deserved no trace of her. She packed light, always had. Rifle, range card, the small laminated photo of her team back in the Army Marksmanship Unit, 5 faces, all men, all long gone to other postings. She'd been the only woman then too, the only one still trying to prove silence could be as powerful as command. Her extraction point was 1 ridge west, 2 kilometers of rough slope and stone. She moved with the patience of someone who knew the forest didn't forgive hurry. Her ghillie suit blended with moss and shadow. Only the faint rhythm of her breathing betrayed that she was human at all. Halfway down she stopped, a faint rustle below. Not animal. She crouched, brought the rifle back up. Two shapes, not seals. Locals, maybe scouts moving through the wreckage. She studied their hands, their posture. No weapons raised, not a threat. Just men trying to understand what had happened in their valley. She let them pass. Mercy was another kind of marksmanship, hitting restraint dead center. By the time she reached the exfil point, the sky had shifted to a cold gray. The dust from the Apache still hung like fog. She could see the tracks of the SEALs' departure, deep, uneven prints, blood smeared where one of them had limped. Ramsay's voice broke through the static again, quieter now. Sable 1, we're aboard. Last bird out in 3. You clear. She looked around the ridge, silent, empty. Nothing but the wind whispering through bullet-scarred trees. Clear, she said. Copy that, appreciate the cover. He hesitated, then added softer. Whoever you are, good work. The transmission cut. She watched the bird lift, a black hawk rising against the setting sun, its rotors pulling dust into a storm around it. For a second, she thought she saw one of them lean toward the door, looking back, maybe trying to find her through the haze. They wouldn't, she was already gone. Night crept fast in the valley. Cold followed. She hiked in silence until the stars took shape above the tree line. Orion, Cassiopeia, constellations her grandfather used to name when they'd lie on the hood of his truck after a hunt. Back then she thought the world was simple. Good shots hit targets. Good soldiers followed orders. But out here, she'd learned something else. Sometimes following orders meant watching people die from arrogance, and sometimes disobeying them meant saving lives. When she reached the forward operating base, the world had already rewritten what happened. The radios buzzed with chatter about intense enemy engagement, rapid response, and air support neutralization. Her name wasn't in the first draft. It never was. She handed in her rifle, logged her brass, wrote 11 engagements, confirmed, and walked out. The armorer glanced at her. Heard you were just supposed to stay with the trucks. Mara gave a half-smile. Guess the trucks had a good view. He didn't laugh. Not disrespect, just realization. Word travels fast in war zones. By morning, even the cooks knew. Someone started calling her Sable 1 again, no sarcasm this time. It was just a name, but it carried weight. The kind of weight that only silence could earn. When Ramsay's team returned from debrief, she was in the corner of the operations tent, hunched over a laptop, reviewing after-action footage. Her hands were still steady, but her eyes looked tired, that deep kind of fatigue that doesn't come from lack of sleep, but from carrying lives inside your sights. He stood there for a long moment before speaking. We didn't see you leave the ridge. You weren't supposed to. He nodded. You saved us. She didn't answer. Compliments never sat well. They sounded too much like closure, and she wasn't ready for that. He stepped closer, lowered his voice. You ever think of teaching this? What you do, the wind reading, the way you plan geometry? She looked up from the screen. You mean patience? He smiled barely. Yeah, that too. Outside, a generator hummed. The valley beyond the wire glowed faintly with the fires still burning. Somewhere out there, families would be mourning. She didn't like to think about that part, but she always did. Because every bullet she'd fired had landed in someone's story. Later that night, she sat on a cot, cleaning her rifle. The rhythm calmed her: brush, oil, cloth, a ritual of control in a world that had none. She paused when her phone buzzed. A message from home, her father. Heard about Mirza, you okay? She stared at the screen for a long time before typing back. Still breathing, still learning. A minute later, his reply came. Your granddad would have been proud. Keep your wind steady. She smiled faintly. Some lessons outlive the men who teach them. She tucked the phone away and stared at the rifle lying across her lap. The metal gleamed faintly in the lamplight. Every scratch told a story, not of violence, but of choice. Morning brought ceremony. The kind the Army does when it doesn't quite know how to say thank you. Officers lined up with clipboards and Ramsay's team stood stiff beside her. She hadn't expected to be there. She hated attention, but Morales had insisted. He approached her after, holding a small velvet box. "From the team," he said quietly. "We've only given a handful of these out, usually posthumously." Inside lay a SEAL Challenge coin, heavy, burnished, etched with their trident. She turned it in her palm. No speech. No cameras, just weight, literal and symbolic. "Thanks," she said simply. "Don't thank us," Morales replied. "You earned it." That evening, she found herself alone in the range tower overlooking the practice lanes. The wind carried the smell of oil and rain. Targets flapped faintly in the distance, bullet holes mapping someone else's learning curve. She raised her scope again just to look, not to fire. Through the glass, the world looked smaller, quieter, as if distance stripped everything unnecessary. She thought about the men who hadn't believed her briefing, about the look on Ramsay's face when the gunfire stopped, about how silence could humble even the loudest voices. And then she thought about what came next. Because surviving wasn't enough, you had to make it mean something. She reached into her jacket and took out the coin, turning it over once before slipping it beside a folded range card and a faded photo. She wasn't sure what any of it meant yet, only that she wasn't done. Somewhere, new recruits would be learning to shoot, to read wind, to trust instinct. Maybe they'd never know her name. Maybe they'd only hear stories of a sniper who saw what others missed, who fired only when it mattered. That was enough. Because sometimes legacy doesn't shout. It whispers between the cracks of memory, in the sound of a rifle bolt closing, in the hush that follows a life saved. Outside, thunder rolled across the hills, distant, harmless, almost gentle. She smiled. Another storm coming, another lesson waiting. And in her chest, the metronome beat on, calm, patient, precise. The shooting range smelled like dust, copper, and memory. Targets stood 1,000 yards away, ghost shapes swaying in Georgia humidity. Behind them, the morning sun stretched long shadows across the red clay. Myra adjusted her scope, not to fire but to watch. 12 students lined up on the firing line. Soldiers, rangers, a few Marines on exchange. None of them looked at her when they missed. They looked at their rifles, the wind flags, anything but the quiet woman packing behind them with a clipboard and a stare sharp enough to cut through excuses. One of them cursed after another miss. She stopped beside him. "Wind didn't move the bullet," she said softly. "You did." He glanced up, surprised. "Ma'am, I compensated for." "You flinched," she interrupted. "Your barrel dipped an inch. That inch becomes 3 feet at this distance. Don't blame the air, it's honest." Silence, then a slow nod. She walked on. This was her new battlefield, not valleys or ridgelines, but minds too used to noise. Here, she fought arrogance, impatience, and the illusion that speed meant skill. The Army had pulled her off deployment 6 months after MERS. Officially, it was a commendation rotation, a chance to teach what she'd done that day. Unofficially, it was because she'd scared people. Quiet competence always did. They called the new experiment the Precision Integration Pilot Program. She called it what it was, learning to listen again. Most of her students were men. Most had already decided who she was before she opened her mouth. A National Guard marksman, some whispered. Lucky shot. Probably just had good intel. She didn't argue, she just waited. Patience had never failed her. It only made the truth slower but stronger when it arrived. When she taught them to read wind, she didn't talk numbers. She talked rhythm. "Listen," she'd say. "The trees tell you. The dust tells you. When the grass bends one way but the mirage moves another, trust the mirage. Air lies less than people." Some got it, most didn't. At first. But then, a week into training, one of her rangers made a 1,000-yard hit in crosswind. and another started whispering that Sable One's method works. Word spread again like it always did, not loud but steady. At night, when the range emptied and the humidity finally lifted, Mara sat alone at the benches, wiping down rifles. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, and the smell of gun oil reminded her of Montana mornings, her father's old Remington across a wooden table, the first time she hit a soda can at 300 yards. "You shot before you thought," he'd said then. "Don't ever do that again." She smiled faintly at the memory. Across the base, the barracks were alive with noise, music, laughter, the echo of younger soldiers pretending they weren't scared of tomorrow. She missed that noise sometimes, the simplicity of it, but she'd traded belonging for solitude long ago. Her phone buzzed again, another message from her father. A photo this time. Her grandfather's old M1 Garand, polished, oiled, ready. "Your inheritance," the text read, "still holds 0. She stared at it for a long while, then typed back, "Still chasing yours." The next morning, a general came to observe her class. Marcus Morrison, the same officer who had reviewed her Mersey report. He'd been the one to write the phrase "extraordinary heroism under fire." She never met him in person until now. He watched from the observation tower, arms crossed, expression unreadable. After the last student fired, he approached her. "You know what they call you, Sergeant Quinn." She didn't look up from her notes. "Depends who's talking, sir." He smiled slightly. "To the SEALs, you're the ghost who saved them. To my staff, you're the reason we rewrote doctrine. To some people," he paused, "you're a question they still can't answer." "Questions are good, sir," she said quietly. "Means they're still thinking." He nodded, then gestured to the students packing up. Whatever you're building here, it works. Keep doing it." When he left, one of her trainees asked, "Ma'am, did that general really sign your citation?" She glanced at him. "Doesn't matter who signed it, matters who learned from it." As months turned to years, the program grew. They brought in specialists, ballistics experts, even psychologists to study her teaching. They wanted to know why her shooters consistently performed better under stress. She told them the secret wasn't science, it was humility. "Pride kills more soldiers than bullets," she said during one briefing. "The moment you think the wind owes you consistency, it changes. Same with war." The colonel in charge scribbled notes. Later in his report, he called it the Sable Principle. She never liked that name. She wasn't trying to build a legend. She was trying to stop others from dying the way arrogance made men die in Mersey. 3 years into the program, she took her class to the high plains of Wyoming for field evaluation. The terrain reminded her too much of Afghanistan, wind-carved ridges, deceptive valleys, skis so wide they made you feel small. During the second day, one of her students, Private First Class Danner, froze mid-drill. He'd lost sight of his target in a sudden gust. He panicked, fired anyway, missed by 10 feet. The spotter scolded him, loud and harsh. Danner looked ready to quit. Myra walked up quietly, crouched beside him. "What did you feel before you fired?" she asked. He swallowed hard. "I felt like I couldn't miss." She nodded. "That's when you should have stopped." He blinked. "Ma'am, confidence isn't control. Stillness is control." Then she lifted her own rifle, sighted down the same lane, and waited. Not for the wind to stop, but for it to speak. When the mirage shimmered just enough, she squeezed. The round struck the center of the steel plate with a distant, satisfying clang. "See," she said, lowering the rifle. "You don't fight the wind, you time it." The rest of the platoon went silent. That night, Danner left a note on the range board before lights out. "Control is quiet." She found it in the morning and pinned it inside her notebook. But even as the program thrived, something in her began to fracture. It wasn't regret. It wasn't guilt. It was something quieter, a weariness that came from being defined by a single day. Every time someone said Mersey, She felt the mountain pressing on her chest again, the dust, the echoes, the unseen faces she'd ended. She'd saved lives, yes, but she'd also taken them. That ledger never balanced cleanly. She tried to talk about it once with a chaplain. He'd listened kindly, nodded, quoted scripture about courage, but it didn't help. Courage wasn't her problem. Memory was. So she buried it where she buried everything, beneath discipline, beneath work. One afternoon, she was cleaning rifles in the armory when a young woman approached her. New recruit, nervous posture, eyes too bright. "Ma'am, I read about you," she said softly. "In the training manual, the MRSA engagement, that was you, right?" Mara didn't look up. Manuals exaggerate. "I don't think they did," the recruit said. "They said one sniper changed the outcome of an ambush. I wanted to say, it made me want to be here." Mara paused, finally meeting her eyes. "Then don't be me," she said. "Be better, be seen before you're needed." The girl smiled awkwardly and left. But the word stayed. Maybe that was what legacy really was, not medals or doctrines, but echoes that turned into someone else's beginning. That night Mara stood on the firing line alone again. The sun was setting, painting the targets gold. She loaded one round, just one, a habit, a reminder. She didn't fire right away. She thought about Mirza, about Ramsay's trembling voice, about how silence had saved lives that day. Then she whispered under her breath, "For the ones I didn't see," and pulled the trigger. The sound rolled out across the plains, soft and final. The steel rang like a bell. Weeks later, General Morrison called her to his office, papers on the desk, a transfer request. "You've built something here," he said. "Now we want you to take it overseas, Advisory Command, Special Integration Unit. You'd be training coalition snipers." She hesitated. "Another deployment." He nodded. "Voluntary, but they could use you." Her eyes flicked to the window. The Georgia sky looked almost like Mirza for a heartbeat, same color, same distance. She thought of her father's voice, the lesson that started it all. Don't shoot to prove, shoot to protect. She looked back at Morrison. "If I go, I'm not going to teach them how to kill better," she said quietly. "I'm going to teach them how to wait longer." He smiled. "That's why we're sending you." When she walked out of the office, the hallway lights hummed above her. She passed a mirror, caught her reflection for the first time in a while. Same steady eyes, same scars of sun and wind, but softer somehow. Not broken, just tempered. She tucked her orders into her jacket, alongside the seal coin. The metal pressed cold against her ribs, a reminder not of glory but of balance. She didn't know what the next mission would bring. But she knew one thing for certain. Whatever came, she'd face it the same way she faced the wind, still, listening, waiting for truth to move first. And as she stepped into the sunlight, the voiceover in her mind whispered the same quiet creed that had followed her since the valley. Sometimes strength isn't loud. Sometimes courage doesn't march. Sometimes dignity doesn't speak. It simply acts. The desert air in Al-Khaybar felt different. Thinner, hotter, meaner. Wind there didn't whisper like it did in the pines of Mirza. It screamed, carving sand into razors that scraped across goggles and skin. Mara Hale Quinn stepped off the C-130 and felt it bite immediately. The heat wrapped her like a dare. Around her, the runway shimmered, and beyond the wire, a sea of nothing stretched until it met the sun. This was Montana. It was Mirza. But it smelled the same: dust, oil, and anticipation. She was back, not as Overwatch this time, as advisor, assigned to the Coalition Sniper Integration Unit, a mixed task force of Americans, Jordanians, and Brits, all pretending they spoke the same tactical language. The camp was a collection of canvas and willpower. Generators coughed. Radios hummed with accents from 3 continents. The new unit commander, Major Albright, briefed her in a tent that flapped like a heartbeat in the wind. "Your job," he said, "is to make them lethal and keep them alive. preferably in that order. She nodded, silent. He waited for a reply that never came, then added, "They'll respect you once they see what you can do. Until then, well, you've met soldiers." She almost smiled. "Respect, just silence with eye contact, sir. I can work with that." The team was rough around the edges. Sergeant Ibrahim Kouari, Jordanian, mid-30s, sharpshooter, sharper pride. Corporal Lena Drew, British recon, quick to speak, quicker to doubt orders. And Specialist Jack Hanley, a young American with too much energy and a tan that said he'd never known snow. They were all good, just not together. 3 different doctrines, 3 different egos. The first day, Ibrahim challenged her openly. "With respect, ma'am," he said, setting up his Dragunov, "our range cards are already perfect. We've been shooting this sector for months." Mara checked his scope, adjusted it 2 clicks. Perfect, a dangerous word. He frowned. "You think you can do better?" "No," she said. "I think the wind can do worse." Then she lay prone, took a reading, and sent a single .300 round across 900 meters. It hit center. The echo rolled back like applause no one dared give. She stood, brushed sand from her sleeves. "We'll start over." No one argued again that day. At night, the camp quieted early. Soldiers hid from the heat inside their tents, writing letters, cleaning rifles, pretending the stars didn't look like witnesses. Mara sat outside, boots buried in sand, radio turned low. The desert hummed. She thought about Merzai, about the sound before the first burst, about the second before she squeezed the trigger. She wondered how many times she'd replayed it without realizing. Her hands still moved like they were aligning crosshairs. Her heart still timed itself in 4-second beats. She didn't regret saving them, but she hadn't yet forgiven herself for how automatic it had felt. The next morning, Major Albright handed her an intel packet. "Convoy protection," he said. "Humanitarian trucks heading through Sector 9. Locals have been ambushed twice this month. You'll ride overwatch, coordinate long-range cover, keep it clean." Mara unfolded the map. Long Valley, open sightlines, too perfect. "Sector 9's predictable," she said. "That's why they'll hit it again." Albright sighed. "You think everything's an ambush, Sergeant?" "Only the ones that are." He didn't argue, he'd read her file. They rolled out before dawn, 4 MRAPs, 2 cargo trucks, and a single overwatch vehicle fitted with a rooftop platform. She rode up top, M2010 across her knees, headset crackling with mixed languages. Hanley handled comms, excited like a rookie. "Feels quiet," he said. "Quiet's just noise waiting its turn," Mara replied. At the 20-kilometer mark, she caught movement, a shimmer near a ridge not quite natural. Her gut tightened. She called it out. "Contact probable, 11 o'clock, 200 meters past the outcrop." The driver slowed. Ibrahim lifted his binos. "Could be heat distortion." "Could be," she said. "Could also be a guy deciding which of us dies first." Then came the flash. RPG trail, thin, fast, lethal. Ambush, North Ridge. The first explosion rocked the lead truck. Sand and shrapnel filled the air. Mara dropped flat, already sighting downrange. The gunner who'd fired was reloading behind a boulder, calm, practiced. She didn't hesitate. Breath. Exhale. Trigger. The .300 Magnum roared. The man vanished from view. Hanley's voice was shaking. "Jesus, you." "Eyes up," she said. "They'll flank next." Another shape appeared, sprinting along the ridge with a radio. She tracked him, squeezed again. The round struck, the radio flew. Coordination broken. Ibrahim's rifle joined hers now. Slower cadence but clean hits. Lena called bearings, adjusting with quick, clipped British urgency. For 15 minutes, the desert became a heartbeat of fire and dust. Then it stopped. The last echo faded, leaving only the wind. When it was over, Major Albright's convoy was intact, 2 wounded, none dead. He approached her afterward, helmet off, sweat streaking his face. "You read that like a book," he said. She wiped sand from her cheek. Same author, different language. He blinked, meaning. "Arrogance writes all ambushes." He stared at her a moment longer, then laughed once short, uncertain. "Remind me never to argue with you, Sergeant." "You can argue," she said. "Just listen when the wind does." That night in the command tent, the debrief was quieter than usual. Even Ibrahim, proud and steady, seemed humbled. He walked up to her after. "I thought you were lucky," he admitted. "Now I think you're cursed." She looked at him. "How that?" "You see danger before it shows itself. That's not luck, that's something else." "Observation," she said. He shook his head. "No, it's something heavier." She didn't answer. Maybe he was right. Maybe seeing too much was its own kind of curse. Days passed. The team grew tighter. Their rhythm softened into trust. She began to let them lead, to make mistakes safely, to learn what she'd learned the hard way, that patience was deadlier than speed. But the mission tempo didn't slow. Ambushes became patterns. Someone was feeding the insurgents' convoy routes. Intel leaks, deliberate timing. Every operation started to feel rehearsed, like the enemy knew her lessons too. One night in the tactical hut, she stared at the map under red light. The routes formed a web. At its center was a name she didn't recognize: Azim, local fixer, contracted guide, too convenient. She closed the folder and looked at Ibrahim. "Who trusts this man?" He frowned. "Everyone. He's been with logistics for years." "Then he's had years to learn our habits." They exchanged a long, silent look. No proof yet, just instinct. But instinct was how she'd survived MERS. 2 days later, a patrol reported Azim missing. The same morning, a fresh ambush hit a supply train 20 kilometers north. Same tactics, same angles. Mara stared at the radio log, jaw tight. It was happening again. Another valley, another trap. She grabbed her rifle, loaded the truck. "We move now." Albright protested, but she was already gone. Her team followed: Ibrahim, Lena, Hanley, no hesitation. Whatever curse she carried, they trusted it now. They reached the site an hour later. Smoke still bled from the convoy. Wounded were scattered, calling out in 3 languages. She dropped to her stomach, glassed the ridge. Movement. 2, maybe 3 shooters, 1 repositioning for elevation. She didn't have the distance advantage this time. She was the one in the valley now. Lena shouted, "They're painting us." Mara took a breath. Hanley smoke front. Ibrahim left flank counterfire. "I'll take high." They obeyed without pause. She crawled up the dune, sand grinding into her palms. The sun burned her neck. She reached the crest, sighted the ridge, and there he was. Azim, the fixer, holding a rifle meant for guidance, not killing, but killing nonetheless. He was aiming downhill, at her people. Mara steadied the crosshairs. Her breath came slow, steady. She could end it now. But hesitation slipped in, not doubt, recognition. His face was calm, almost regretful. He wasn't shooting for hate, he was shooting for debt. Someone owned him. Her finger tightened anyway. Because mercy, in this moment, would be murder somewhere else. She fired. The recoil jolted her shoulder, the sound echoing off the dunes. Azim fell, the rifle sliding from his grip. The battle ended as quickly as it began. She stayed still for a moment, staring through the scope at the body lying in sand that looked too red under the sun. Then she whispered, "I'm sorry," though she knew the wind would take it. Back at camp, the report would call it a decisive action. But in her chest, it felt less like victory and more like confirmation. No matter how far she went, every fight would find her in the same way, through silence, through necessity. Major Albright found her sitting alone outside her tent that night, rifle across her knees. "You did what you had to," he said. She nodded. That's what scares me. He frowned. You think you're losing your edge? No, she said quietly. I think I'm losing parts of myself to it. He didn't know how to answer. Few ever did. Later, Ibrahim approached with 2 cups of instant coffee. He handed her one. You know, they'll write this up as another miracle shot. Then they'll be wrong again. He smiled faintly. Then tell me, Sergeant Quinn, what was it really? She stared into the dark horizon, where the desert met the stars. It was the same thing it always is, she said. Timing, discipline, and the hope that next time I won't need either. They drank in silence, the wind brushing past like an old friend that still carried bad news. The next morning she packed her gear. Orders were already waiting, reassignment back stateside for evaluation and rest. Rotation complete, the document read. She folded it neatly, slid it next to the seal coin. Another chapter, same lesson. Before boarding the transport, she looked back at the dunes. The sun was rising, gold and merciless. She whispered under her breath, a promise to the sand, to Merzai, to every place that had taught her what stillness could do. I'll keep listening. And the desert answered, as it always did, not with words but with wind. The first sound she noticed when she got home was silence. Not the tactical kind, not the poised quiet before a shot. This was different, thicker, empty in a way that made her heart ache. Montana had never changed much. Same mountains, same wind cutting through the pines, same house where her father still kept the porch light on like she might show up any day. And now she had. He met her at the door without words. Just a long, quiet look that said, I was worried and I knew you'd come back. He hugged her tight enough that her rifle case pressed into his ribs. You smell like sand, he said softly. She smiled faintly. Beats gunpowder. Inside, the house still looked like her childhood, photos of hunts, medals her grandfather never displayed properly, a wall lined with rifles older than both of them. The world outside might have evolved, but this cabin was still a museum of discipline and ghosts. He poured coffee, black, no sugar. She sat at the kitchen table, staring out the window toward the tree line. Merzai, he asked after a long pause. Still there, she said, just quieter. He nodded. That's how ghosts work. They didn't talk about war much after that. They never needed to. The pauses said enough. The next morning she walked to the old range behind the property, the one where she'd learned wind before she learned math. The targets were rusted now, half buried in snowmelt and mud. She brushed one clean with her glove. It wasn't about practice. It was about remembering where the rhythm started, the sound of breath sinking with distance, the feel of her father's voice correcting her grip, the memory of her first bulls, and the pride that felt innocent then. She set up a single target at 600 yards. The M2010 felt heavy this time, not from weight, but from history. When she fired, the recoil felt softer, like the rifle was tired too. She smiled. Still works, she murmured. From the porch her father watched. Still does, he said. For a few weeks, life tried to be simple. She helped around the property, fixed fences, drove into town for groceries. People smiled at her politely, never quite asking what she'd done overseas, but always hinting they'd read something about her. A man at the feed store said, "You the soldier girl from that article." She nodded once. He grinned. "Heard you saved a bunch of seals. Bet that felt good." She didn't know how to answer. Good wasn't the word. Necessary maybe, heavy definitely. So she just said, "It felt quiet." He didn't understand, but that was fine. Most never did. One evening she sat on the porch with her father, the mountains glowing orange under sunset. He handed her a beer and said, "You think you'll stay?" She didn't answer right away. "I don't know," she said finally. "Home feels like a place that forgives you before you ask. I'm not sure I deserve that yet." He looked at her, eyes soft. Forgiveness isn't earned, Mara, it's accepted. She looked out at the horizon. Maybe I'm not ready to accept it. He nodded, then keep walking until you are. A few days later, a letter arrived. No return address, just military paper typed neatly. Advisory request, Civilian Precision Integration Seminar, Fort Benning. She laughed under her breath. They can't even let me retire quietly. Her father smiled. The wind doesn't stop blowing just because you want it to. She turned the letter over in her hands. It wasn't a deployment. It wasn't a war. It was teaching again. Maybe that was what peace looked like for people like her. Not stillness, but service. She packed that night. Fort Benning felt smaller now, or maybe she'd grown beyond it. The buildings were the same, beige, efficient, humming with the same young confidence she'd once carried. She met the new class of instructors, younger, eager, some barely 30. They knew her name but not her face. That was fine. Names carried weight, faces didn't need to. The seminar was different from her old sniper program. It wasn't about hitting targets anymore. It was about ethics, about how to train shooters to think before they shoot. That was the Army's new initiative. Reflection, not reaction. And they'd chosen her to teach it. The first day, she walked into the classroom wearing plain fatigues. A dozen eyes followed her, expecting bravado, a story, a legend. She gave them none. She wrote one word on the whiteboard, choice. Then she turned. You think your weapon is this, she said, holding up a rifle. It's not, it's this. She tapped her temple. And this. She pressed her hand over her heart. That's where every shot starts, and that's where every shot ends. A young lieutenant raised his hand. Ma'am, with respect, how do you know when it's right to pull the trigger? She paused. The room went still. When it costs you something, she said. If it doesn't, you're not doing it right. No one spoke after that. Later, one of the instructors, Captain Ray's, mid-30s, curious eyes, caught her outside by the bleachers. Sergeant Quinn, he said, I read your Mirza file. She didn't turn. Everyone does. It's not the gunfire that got me, he said quietly. It's the silence after. How'd you live with that? She took a long breath, watching a group of cadets running drills below. You don't live with it, she said. You live through it. Some days you do better than others. He nodded, thoughtful. You ever think about writing it down? She looked at him. Some stories shouldn't have endings. That night she couldn't sleep. She walked to the range, barefoot, feeling the cool concrete under her feet. The moonlight spilled across the targets like old ghosts waiting to be acknowledged. She set her rifle down and just listened. The air moved through the trees, soft and low. The same sound she'd heard on every battlefield in every valley, but tonight it didn't sound like a warning. It sounded like memory forgiving itself. She whispered into the dark, I'm still listening. And the wind, her oldest teacher, answered. A week later she got a call. An unfamiliar voice on the line, male, older. Staff Sergeant Quinn, this is Lieutenant Cole Ramsey. She froze. It had been years since she'd heard that name. Ramsey, she said quietly, didn't think I'd ever hear your voice again. He chuckled softly. Didn't think I'd ever get the chance. I'm at Quantico now, training division. I heard you're teaching at Benning. I am. Good, he said. You should know my team still talks about you. Morales keeps that coin framed in his office. We've been meaning to tell you something. She leaned against the wall. What's that? He paused. You didn't just save us that day. You changed how we work. We don't laugh at Overwatch anymore. We listen. For a long moment, neither spoke. The connection carried a kind of peace that didn't need ceremony. Thank you, she said softly. He laughed again, quieter this time. No, Sergeant Quinn, thank you for teaching us that silence can have aim. The line clicked dead. After the call, she sat alone in her quarters, staring at the seal coin. For years, it had felt like a burden, a reminder of what had been lost. Tonight, it felt lighter. Maybe that was what healing really was. Not forgetting, but carrying it differently. She tucked the coin back into her jacket and looked toward the horizon outside. Dawn was coming. The light was soft, forgiving. She whispered to herself, "You did what you had to." And for the first time, she believed it. That weekend, she drove north, no orders, no destination. Just roads and open sky. The sound of tires on asphalt felt almost like music. Somewhere between states, she pulled over by a clearing. The grass was tall, the wind steady. She set up her rifle one last time, just to feel the earth breathe under her again. Through the scope, she saw the world not as a target but as a lesson. Everything moves, everything waits, everything forgives eventually. She smiled, whispered a prayer that wasn't about victory, but about peace. Then she took a deep breath, aimed at nothing, and fired into the horizon. The shot echoed, soft and infinite. She didn't watch where it landed. Some truths don't need confirmation. When she returned to the truck, the radio played an old country song her father used to hum. She rolled down the window, let the wind pour in, and smiled at the road ahead. The war had followed her for years. But somewhere between the echoes and the silence, she'd learned to stop running from it. Now she simply walked beside it. Because some ghosts aren't meant to be buried. They're meant to be understood. And sometimes, just sometimes, that's enough. The invitation arrived in a plain envelope. No crest, no ceremony. Just a line of text stamped across the top. Defense Ethics and Engagement Oversight Board Testimony Request. Mara stared at it for a long moment, the coffee in her hand going cold. They were calling her to Washington. Not to honor her, to question her. She expected this someday. The military loved building myths until it had to account for them. She folded the letter, slid it beside the seal coin, and whispered to no one. Guess the silence finally made too much noise. 2 weeks later, the city swallowed her. The marble buildings, the flags, the polished floors, everything felt too clean for the kind of truths she carried. In the mirror of the hotel bathroom, she barely recognized herself. The desert tan had faded. The eyes hadn't. They were still sharp but quieter. The kind of eyes that had seen too many beginnings and too few endings. When she walked into the hearing room, cameras hummed in the corners, and officers in uniform lined the tables. Civilians filled the back rows, journalists, aides, people who had never smelled cordite but liked to write about it. A woman at the center, Senator Bristow, greeted her with a professional smile. "Sergeant Quinn, thank you for your service. We're here to review the doctrine that bears your name, the Sable Principle." Myra almost laughed. "Didn't know I had one." Bristow gestured to a screen behind her. Footage played, drones over Mersey Valley, dots of heat, gunfire bursts, timestamps. Every movement recorded, dissected, measured. "You changed how our operators train," the senator said. "We'd like to understand how." Mara took her seat, folded her hands, and met the senator's gaze. "I didn't change anything," she said quietly. "I reminded them what happens when they stop listening." A murmur rippled through the room. The questioning began. They asked about Mersey, about the number of shots fired, about her decision to act without authorization. One of the officers leaned forward. "You engaged without direct command clearance, Sergeant. Why?" Mara looked at him evenly. "Because command wasn't the one dying." A pause, pen stopped moving. "Rules exist for a reason," the officer pressed. "So does instinct," she replied. "One keeps you safe in policy, the other keeps you alive in practice." Bristow interjected gently. "But that balance between instinct and order, that's what we're here to understand. Would you say you disobeyed?" Mara thought for a long moment. The cameras were still. Finally she said, "No, I adapted." They moved on to Al-Khaybar. The ambush, the shot that killed Azam. A civilian advisor, gray suit, sharp tone, asked. You executed a local asset without formal confirmation of guilt. She didn't flinch. He was about to kill my team. I confirmed enough. You made a moral decision based on assumption, he said. Mara met his gaze. Every bullet is a moral decision. Pretending it isn't, that's the real assumption. The advisor hesitated. The senator watched her carefully, studying the weight behind every word. Hours passed, questions blurred, the lights were hot, the air too still. But through it all, Mara stayed calm, the same calm she'd learned under fire. Stillness wasn't just survival, it was statement. When the final question came, it was the only one that mattered. Senator Bristow leaned forward, voice softer now. If you could teach every soldier one thing from what you've seen, what would it be? Mara looked down at her hands, the same hands that had steadied rifles, lifted wounded, buried friends. That humility saves more lives than bullets, she said. And that silence, the kind that listens, not hides, is the most dangerous weapon we have. Bristow nodded slowly. Thank you, Sergeant, that will be all. Afterward, outside the building, reporters swarmed. Microphones, cameras, questions that all sounded the same. Do you think you're a hero? Do you regret your actions? Will there be a movie? She kept walking. One young journalist, barely out of school, jogged beside her. Sergeant Quinn, just one question, how do you live with what you've done? Mara stopped, turned. You don't, she said. You live with what you've learned. Then she stepped into the street, vanishing into the city noise that drowned every other question. That night she stood on the hotel balcony overlooking the Potomac. The air smelled like rain. Below, traffic pulsed, a rhythm of lives untouched by the wars fought in their name. She thought of her students, her father, Ramsay's voice on the line. All the pieces of her life moving in different directions, but tied by one thread, the quiet between decisions. The rain began to fall, she let it. For the first time in years, she didn't flinch at the sound of impact. The next morning, she boarded her return flight to Georgia. The aisle was crowded with business suits and chatter. No one recognized her. She preferred it that way. As the plane climbed, clouds swallowed the city. She closed her eyes and let her mind drift back to Mersey, to the ridgeline, to that first shot that had rewritten everything. In the darkness behind her eyelids, she could still feel the trigger break, the echo rolling down the valley. But now it wasn't thunder. It was echo, distant, fading. When she opened her eyes again, she whispered to herself, let it go. Back at Bennying, the world didn't wait for her. There were new recruits, new briefings, new questions. War never slept, it just changed uniforms. She walked into the classroom one morning and found a quote written on the whiteboard by one of her students. Control is quiet, Sable 1. She smiled. Who wrote that? A cadet raised his hand. We all did, ma'am. Figured it should stay up there. She nodded. Then make sure you understand it. Quiet doesn't mean passive, it means precise. They nodded, scribbling notes. Weeks later, she received a package with no sender listed. Inside was a folded letter and a photo. The photo showed Lieutenant Ramsay's team, older now, standing on a tarmac, smiling. Morales held the seal coin up to the camera. On the back in marker were 3 words. We still listen. The letter beneath was short. Thought you should know, Sable 1. Your shot didn't just save us, it slowed us down. In the best way. Every mission we hear your voice. Wind left, half mil. Breathe. Not just about aim, about everything. Thank you. She folded it carefully, tucking it beside the coin. Some medals were metal, others were words. One evening, while walking the range alone, she found Captain Reyes sitting by the berm, staring at the sky. Can't sleep either, she asked. He shook his head. Been reading your transcripts from the hearing. You know they're using your testimony in officer ethics training now. She raised an eyebrow. Guess I'm a lesson plan." He smiled, better that than a myth. She looked out at the targets gleaming under the floodlights. Myths don't breathe, lessons do. He glanced at her. "What's next for you, Mara?" She thought for a long moment. "Maybe nothing," she said. "Maybe that's the point, to stop trying to be useful and just be." He nodded slowly. "You think you'll ever fire again?" She looked at her hands, then at the horizon. "Only if I have to remind the wind who I am." Months later, spring came to Georgia. The range grass grew wild, the air thick with pollen. She spent her days helping new instructors, not teaching, just observing. Her nights she wrote notes in a leather journal, not about missions, but about stillness, forgiveness, and the thin line between vigilance and peace. She never meant for anyone to read it, but one day she left it open on her desk, and a trainee found a page that read, "You don't heal from war by forgetting it. You heal by teaching it differently." By the next morning, copies had spread through every training office on base. She pretended to be annoyed. Secretly, she was relieved. Her father visited that summer. He watched her class through binoculars from the observation deck. When the firing stopped, he said quietly, "Your grandfather would have liked this." She smiled, "Because I'm teaching." "No," he said, "because you're finally missing on purpose." She laughed, surprised. "What do you mean?" He grinned. "You're letting others hit the targets now." She nodded, eyes glinting. "Guess that's the point." He looked proud, that rare kind of pride that doesn't need words. That night she walked the range one last time before heading home. The air was still, the world waiting for something. She stopped halfway down the line, set her rifle on the ground, and just listened. The wind moved softly, shifting east to west, familiar, patient, alive. She whispered, still listening. Somewhere in the distance, thunder rolled. Not warning this time, just weather. She smiled. The same calm that had carried her through chaos now felt like peace. Sometimes, strength isn't in the shot you take. It's in the ones you no longer need to. She turned toward the horizon, the evening light folding around her like forgiveness. The voiceover would fade there, soft, steady, certain. In the end, she wasn't the ghost who saved the SEALs. She was the voice that taught them, and everyone who came after, that silence can protect louder than any gunfire. Sometimes dignity doesn't speak. It simply acts. The letter came in the middle of the night. Not through official channels, through a friend. A single envelope slid under her door at Fort Benning. No insignia, no seal, just a name typed across the top. Project Nightwind, advisory request. She frowned. Nightwind wasn't a combat unit. She'd heard whispers, an international task group built for crisis response, halfway between military precision and humanitarian rescue. The kind that entered earthquakes, hostage zones, or collapsed cities. People who lived in the gray space between violence and salvation. She poured coffee, sat on the edge of her bed, and read it again. Your expertise in long-range reconnaissance and ethical engagement is requested for operational advisement. Non-lethal integration preferred. Optional participation. Optional, that was the dangerous word. The one that sounded like freedom but always meant a choice that would change everything. She set the letter down, stared at the wall, and whispered, "You never really leave, do you?" 3 days later, she was standing on a tarmac in Germany. Wind howled against the hangar doors. Inside, a group of specialists waited: NATO, Red Cross, and a few operators she didn't recognize. They weren't soldiers in the usual sense. Their uniforms were mismatched, their faces calm in a way that only came from people who'd already seen the worst of the world. A woman approached, extending a hand. Commander Talia Voss, Nightwind's director. Mara shook it, firm. "You know what I teach, I don't pull triggers anymore." Voss nodded. "That's why you're perfect for this." Nightwind wasn't about war. It was about timing, the kind that decided whether a hostage survived or a village starved before airlift arrived. Their motto was painted in fading black across the command wall. Precision saves lives. Mara liked that. It was the closest thing to truth she'd heard in years. She was there to train a small detachment, 12 specialists in long-range observation, mostly non-military. Engineers, medics, drone pilots. They didn't need to kill, they needed to see, to predict threats before they happened. She started with what she knew best, awareness. How you see, she told them on the first morning, decides what survives. Their base sat high in the Bavarian Alps, glass, steel, and quiet efficiency. From the balcony, she could see valleys filled with fog. It reminded her of Mersey, but softer, gentler. A version of war that hadn't learned to hate itself yet. At night, she walked the training fields alone. She stopped carrying her rifle everywhere, but the absence felt strange, like missing a limb. The weight of it had balanced her, even when she hated what it represented. Sometimes she caught herself pressing her shoulder, as if the recoil still lived there. It did in a way. The first real test came sooner than anyone expected. A landslide had buried part of a mountain village near the Austrian border, 40 civilians trapped, unstable terrain, armed looters exploiting the chaos. Nightwind was dispatched. Mara didn't plan to go. She was supposed to advise remotely. But when the call came, "We're losing visibility, we need someone who reads terrain like language," she was already lacing her boots. Old instincts woke up fast. Within hours, she was back in a transport, headset on, watching coordinates flicker across a digital map. Her pulse was steady, too steady. Voss looked at her from across the cabin. "You sure about this, Quinn?" She nodded once. "I'm not here to fight, I'm here to see." The helicopter dropped them near the ridge. Wind roared, snow cutting like glass. Visibility 40 meters at best. The terrain below was chaos, half the village gone, the rest clinging to mud and prayer. Mara set up a vantage point with 2 medics and a communications tech. Through her spotting scope, she could see heat signatures moving in the ruins, some alive, some not. Then she saw something worse. Men with rifles, not rescuers. Looters, maybe deserters, stripping supplies, threatening villagers who had nothing left to lose. Voss came over the net. "Local police are 30 minutes out. We can't engage. Non-lethal protocols only." Mara's jaw tightened. "Then we better get creative." She used the same precision that once ended lives now to protect them. She tracked the looters' positions, timing their patrols, predicting where they'd move next. Then she guided the team through the debris like she'd guide a sniper to his shot, except this time the target was safety. "Shift left 5 meters, wait for the wind, move on my count." Her voice stayed low, calm, measured. The medics called it eerie, like she could see the future. When the team reached a group of trapped villagers, one of the looters spotted them, raised his weapon. Time slowed. Mara didn't have her rifle, but her voice found its command tone anyway. "Flashbang now." The medic tossed it, the man dropped. No blood, just light confusion. By the time he recovered, the team was gone, and 12 civilians were alive because of her timing. Hours later, when the last survivor was airlifted out, Mara stood at the edge of the ridge, watching the sunrise break through the fog. Voss joined her. "You still don't like coming back, do you?" Mara shook her head. "It's not the coming back I hate, it's realizing I'm still good at it." Voss studied her. "You ever think being good at this might be your peace, not your punishment?" Mara didn't answer. The question lingered longer than it should have. Back at base, Nightwind held a small debrief. No applause, no medals, just quiet acknowledgement. That was how she liked it. After the briefing, one of the younger specialists, a kid named Mikkel, approached her. Barely 22, nervous, eyes full of the same naive fire she once had. "Ma'am," he said, How do you stay calm when everything's falling apart? She smiled slightly. You don't, you just make calm louder than fear. He nodded, trying to absorb it, and she realized he'd remember that sentence long after she was gone. Weeks passed, missions came and went. Earthquakes, hostage extractions, convoy escorts through unstable regions. She didn't fire a weapon once, but her influence was everywhere in how the team breathed, moved, waited. She'd become what she never thought she could be, the silence before chaos that prevented it. And yet, sometimes, late at night, when the wind rattled the glass windows of her quarters, she'd wake with her hands trembling, as if gripping a rifle that wasn't there. Her body remembered things her heart still refused to. One night during a training review, Voss found her sitting alone, staring at the shooting range through the observation glass. You miss it, Voss said. Mara didn't turn. I miss what it used to mean. And what was that? Control, she said quietly. The illusion that if I was precise enough, maybe the world would make sense. Voss leaned on the railing beside her. Did it? Mara smiled faintly. Sometimes, for about 4 seconds at a time. Months later, she received another letter, this time, handwritten, carried by a pilot returning from a joint mission in Syria. It was from her father. Your mother's old barn roof finally gave out. I fixed it wrong twice before getting it right. Guess I'm still learning patience. Hope you're learning peace. Below the words was a small note in smaller writing. When the wind stops talking, come home. She read it twice, folded it carefully, and looked out at the snowy peaks beyond the base. For the first time, she wondered if maybe the wind wasn't done talking, but it was finally saying goodbye. Her final mission with Nightwind came that spring. A medical evacuation in the Caucasus, simple, clean until it was. An avalanche cut off the path, trapping 2 rescuers on the wrong side of the ridge. The only chance to reach them was to guide a chopper through a narrow valley full of crosswinds and blind corners. Mara stood on the ledge, headset on, scanning the storm through her binoculars. Her hands were steady again like they'd been on Mur's, except now she wasn't hunting death. She was outsmarting it. She timed the gusts, marked the moments of still air, and fed the pilot coordinates like she was calling wind for a rifle shot. Now drop 5 degrees. Wait, hold. Push right 2 seconds, that's your window. The helicopter tilted, vanished behind the ridge, then reappeared seconds later, safe, climbing into open sky with both survivors aboard. The comms erupted in relief. Mara just closed her eyes and breathed. That same rhythm, that same peace, only this time no one had to die for it. When they returned to base, Voss met her at the hangar. You're leaving, aren't you? Mara nodded. Yeah, think the wind's finally quiet. Voss smiled softly. Then thank you, you gave this unit something we didn't know we needed. What's that? Stillness. Weeks later, Mara was back in Montana. The snow had melted. The river near the property ran louder than she remembered. Her father was on the porch again, same place, same mug of coffee. You look lighter, he said. Maybe I finally stopped fighting the quiet, she replied. He nodded, eyes glinting. Told you the wind would tell you when it was done. She smiled, sitting beside him. They didn't talk for a long while. They didn't need to. Because in the soft rustle of the trees, in the distant echo of a life lived through precision and patience, she heard something she hadn't in years, peace that didn't ask for permission. The world moved, the wind changed, but for once Mara Hale Quinn didn't. She just listened. And somewhere deep inside that silence, the story of Sable One finally rested. The first snowfall came early that year. Mara watched it from the window of her father's cabin, the same view she'd stared through as a child. The line of pines, the rise of the hill, the faint path leading to the range behind the house. The snow fell slow, gentle. Not the kind that erased tracks, but the kind that remembered them. She poured coffee, sat by the fire, and opened the leather journal she'd kept since her days at Bennying. Its pages were thick with handwriting, notes, fragments, half-thoughts. At the top of one page, she'd written a line she couldn't remember writing. "The wind never stops. It just waits for someone worth listening to." She smiled faintly. Maybe it had always been waiting for her. Outside, the range still stood. The wooden posts were weathered, the paint on the targets chipped. She hadn't fired a rifle in almost a year. Not because she'd sworn it off, but because the need had finally gone quiet. Sometimes, when she closed her eyes, she could still hear the echo of that single shot in Mersey Valley, the one that changed everything. But now it didn't echo through guilt. It echoed through gratitude. Every sound had meaning, she'd once said. Even the ones that ended something. That morning, the phone rang. She let it buzz twice before answering. "Sergeant Quinn." She knew the voice immediately, Captain Ray's. "Been a while," she said. "Too long," he replied. "You off the grid now?" "Trying to be." He chuckled. "You're not doing a great job. The Pentagon's still quoting your hearing testimony." She laughed softly. "Guess silence really does make noise." Ray's paused. "I'm calling about something else. They're forming a mentorship program for veteran instructors in Tur Branch. They want your input, not as a sniper, as a teacher." She leaned back in her chair. "You still can't take a hint, can you?" "Maybe not," he said. "But you once told me we don't heal by forgetting. We heal by teaching differently. You've still got more to teach." She looked out the window, the snow swirling over the field where she'd once learned wind. "I'll think about it," she said. "I'll take that as a yes." When she hung up, her father appeared at the doorway. "That was the Army again?" he asked. She nodded, sort of. He studied her for a long moment. "You look calmer when you're teaching. Always did." She smiled. Maybe that's because it's the only thing that ever made sense. He poured himself a cup of coffee, sat across from her. "So, what's stopping you?" She sighed. "Maybe I'm scared that if I go back, I'll lose the peace I've built." Her father nodded. "Peace isn't a place, Mara. It's how you stand when everything else moves." She looked at him, really looked at him, and saw the same quiet strength that had built her. "Maybe you're right," she said softly. He smiled, "Always was." 2 months later, she was back at Fort Bennying. Not as a soldier, not as an instructor, as a mentor. The new recruits didn't know her history. To them, she was just another advisor with calm eyes and a voice that cut through noise like a compass. Her first day back, she stood on the observation deck, watching a group of trainees line up for long-range drills. Their excitement reminded her of herself, before the weight of precision had taught her humility. A young woman adjusted her scope too quickly, jerking the rifle left. Mara watched her breathe too fast, her hand trembling slightly. She remembered that tremor. She remembered what it meant, not fear of failure, but fear of being seen failing. Mara walked down the line, knelt beside her. "Slow down," she said quietly. "Wind's not your enemy, it's your partner. It's trying to tell you something." The trainee looked up. "What's it saying?" Mara smiled softly. "That you're fighting the wrong thing." The shot cracked. The round hit dead center. The girl blinked, half in disbelief. "I didn't even aim that hard." "Exactly," Mara said. "You listened." The trainee grinned. "Ma'am, what's your call sign?" Mara hesitated. It had been years since she'd said it aloud. "Sable 1," she answered. The trainees looked at each other, recognition dawning. One of them whispered, "Wait, the Sable 1." Mara stood. Names don't matter, listening does. Then she walked away, leaving the myth behind her again. That evening she sat alone on the bleachers, watching the sun dip below the range. Captain Ray's joined her, 2 cups of coffee in hand. "You know," he said, "half the recruits are already quoting you." Bad idea, she said. They'll sound too serious. He smiled. They respect you, and that matters. She shook her head. Respect fades, understanding doesn't. He sipped his coffee, thoughtful. You ever think you'll stop doing this? Mara looked at the horizon, the sky turning gold, the air still. When I stop feeling the wind, she said. Weeks turned into months. Seasons rolled quietly by. The recruits she trained began to graduate, spreading across units and continents, carrying fragments of her lessons with them. Somewhere in Syria, a medic paused before firing a warning shot, remembering her words. Precision is mercy. In Ukraine, a spotter steadied his breathing by whispering her mantra. Wind left, half mil, breathe. In a humanitarian corridor in Sudan, a rescue pilot adjusted altitude by instinct, the way she'd once guided helicopters through storm and avalanche. She'd become invisible again, but this time by choice. Her presence lived in pauses, in decisions, in restraint. The world would never know her name, but the lives spared because of her silence would remember her forever. One evening back in Montana, she received a small package. No return label, no seal, just a folded note and a photo. The photo showed a group of trainees, her old class. They were older now, standing on a windswept plateau, holding up a simple wooden sign. On it, painted in white letters, Sable Range, train quiet. Her throat tightened. The note read only, for the one who taught us that stillness isn't weakness, it's focus. Your students. She held the letter to her chest, eyes closing against the quiet ache that filled the room. For the first time, the silence didn't hurt. It healed. Later that night, she walked to the old range behind her home. The moon was high, the world silver. She set up one target, not for precision but for memory. Her father had cleaned the rifle earlier that week. It gleamed under moonlight like it still remembered who she was. She lay prone, feeling the earth beneath her chest. The air was cold, crisp, clear, the kind of night snipers dream of. She looked through the scope, but this time she didn't see a target. She saw the world as it was, flawed, fragile, beautiful. She smiled. Then she whispered, not to herself, not to the wind, but to the life she'd lived. We're done fighting. And she pulled the trigger. The shot echoed through the valley, a clean, perfect sound that didn't take anything, didn't end anything. It was a salute to all she'd learned, all she'd lost, all she'd found again. The echo faded into the trees, and in its place came something rare, a silence that didn't need to be earned anymore. Months later, new trainees at Fort Benning would ask instructors who first said it. The phrase painted above every sniper range now, carved into wood, etched into policy. Silence protects louder than any gunfire. No one quite remembered when it started. Some said it was an old legend. Others said it was born from a woman who listened to wind more than command. But those who'd met her, those who'd been lucky enough to learn under her, knew the truth. She wasn't a myth. She was proof that Grace could wear a uniform. Years passed. Her journal, the one filled with her notes, eventually found its way into the archives at the Military Ethics Division. They called it the Sable Doctrine. It wasn't about combat. It was about restraint. It taught that heroism wasn't always the louder act. Sometimes it was the decision not to pull the trigger. Her words became policy, then principle, then tradition. But in the quiet corners of those who'd known her, she was never a doctrine. She was the wind that whispered, breathe, wait, listen. Back in Montana, long after the medals and myths had faded, an old man stood by a grave that didn't bear a rank or a title. Just a single line carved into stone. Mara Hail Qin, Sable One. Sometimes dignity doesn't speak, it simply acts. The wind moved softly through the pines. If you listened close enough, it almost sounded like a rifle's exhale, the steady calm between life and choice. The kind that didn't end a story. The kind that promised it would never really fade. End of story.